Americans didn't think a war, fought across an ocean, would affect them. They thought the neutrality of the United States in World War I would be permanent. People went about their daily routines, children roamed the streets, businesses thrived. Joyful youth did not seem fleeting in the slightest. It was hard for Americans to feel any effects of the war before their involvement. They didn't see it was happening, and likewise, they didn't want to believe it was happening. When on April 6, 1917, the U.S. joined its allies, Britain, France, and Russia, to fight in World War I, Americans were not prepared. Their only encounter with the war was with glamorized propaganda from the movies. America's sheltered boys were not ready to encounter the ugliness of war, yet they were forced to.
American soldiers had no idea what they were getting into with World War I. They were renowned for their complete ineptitude.
One soldier described the ominous nature of the war.
"It may be he shall take my hand, and lead me into his dark land, and close my eyes, and quench my breath. It may be I shall pass him still. I have a rendezvous with death, on some scarred slope of battered hill. Alan Seeger, I have a rendezvous with death."
Soldiers didn't know what to expect, and they're thrown into what is the first modern war, in which these great breakthroughs of technology of the Industrial Revolution are applied to killing people on an industrial scale. They really make the horrors of trench warfare move from something that is descriptive for Americans to a lived reality for all of these soldiers. They come over fresh-faced, and they do not expect what's going to happen. So you have a certain level of psychological trauma there that enhances the physical trauma of modern warfare.
Soldiers were demoralized. They resided in unsanitary, disease-ridden trenches and lived in constant fear of surprise attacks, dreading the explosion of shells at any given moment. Perpetual uncertainty and fear of death raided the minds of these American boys.
Our men have had a terrible experience of 72 hours in trenches, drenched through and in some places knee-deep in mud and water. To see them come out and line up and march off is almost terrible. They don't look like strong young men. Their backs are bent, and they stagger and totter along with the weight of their packs. Their faces are white and haggard, and their eyes glare out from mud, which, with short, bristly beards, give them an almost beast-like look. They look like wounded or sick wild things. I've seen nothing like it. Captain Noel Chavas.
The horrors of the Great War caused unprecedented destruction, not only of the European landscape, but also to the millions who made the ultimate sacrifice of war, the loss of life. The brutality of trench warfare claimed the bodies of soldiers who faced horrific injuries with inadequate medical care. Traumatic experiences, both physical and psychological, shook their minds. Infamously, shell shock became the common explanation for the mental disturbances of soldiers who felt the impact of exploding shells. There was a blurred line between concussive and psychological damage.
So people got understandably very frightened. They saw people slaughtered around them, and it became too much to deal with. So some people developed what we would now call PTSD. Some of this was emotional response to what was going on, but some of it was also physical response.
The effects of shell shock could induce debilitating complications, such as blindness, deafness, and physical twitches. In less extreme cases, symptoms such as sleep disturbance, memory loss, and dizziness ailed shell-shocked soldiers. During the Great War, despite the widespread interest in curing shell shock, the term in itself made distinguishing between the physical brain damage and psychological trauma tricky, and deepened the horrific impact on the victims of the war. World War I ended November 11, 1918. American soldiers were discharged, eager to go back to their long-missed homeland. But their homeland wasn't so eager to welcome them back. American society was booming as a result of mass industrialization, and new attitudes prioritized efficiency above all else. The progressive movement, which occupied Americans from 1900 to the beginning of the Great Depression, was just that, progressive.
There's a certain ideology in the United States that we think of now, that we describe now as American exceptionalism. This has to do with the belief that the United States is a unique place and a better place, and a place that can avoid history.
During this period, reformers helped improve the lots of many groups, such as immigrants and women. However, there was one startling exception to this push for reform: disabled veterans. Although there had been a tradition of pensions for war veterans in the past, after World War I, anti-war progressives saw wounded soldiers not as valiant war heroes, but as parasites, looking for handouts. Progressives claimed that the pension system was corrupt because greedy malingerers pretended to be disabled so that they could reap economic benefits. These so-called reformers shamed soldiers for their economic dependence. Disabled soldiers came home from war to a pitiless society, one that saw them as a burden to the country's welfare and pension system. They wanted to pretend the war had never happened.
Looking at the war wounded, accepting the great trauma of the war, doesn't fit within that progressive narrative of what the United States should look like. People would try to forget the war.
This country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. It disfranchises its own citizens. It steals from us. It insults us. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Although Du Bois was speaking of the plight of returning African American veterans, in a larger sense, he gave words to the struggle of all veterans, fighting to return home to a country who no longer wanted them, for they represented an ugly truth in a war they'd rather forget. The culture of shunning disabled veterans in Progressive-era America manifested itself in attempts to hide the unfortunate effects of war and to, quote, rebuild war cripples, so that they could re-enter civilian society as if the war had never happened. There was an increased emphasis on the ugly laws, a set of laws put in place toward the second half of the 19th century that required diseased, maimed, or disfigured, and therefore, quote, unsightly individuals to hide their deformities so as not to be seen by the public. Those who did not hide their deformities were fined, sometimes arrested. Veterans were given pins to identify their deformities as legitimate deficiencies, but if they forgot or refused to wear the pins, they too were likely to be fined or arrested. Even if their disfigured faces were considered legitimate, soldiers were still encouraged to hide their deformities. Many soldiers whose faces were disfigured as a result of having shells explode in front of them hid behind masks made to look like normal human faces. There was also a rise in the production of prosthetics. Before the war, prosthetics were rare, custom-made by prostheticists for the wealthy. But after World War I, prosthetics were made widely available because of the focus on rebuilding disabled veterans, and therefore replacing missing limbs. The prosthetic limbs could be fitted with different attachments, like forks for eating and catcher's mitts for playing baseball. Also, the veterans could be as similar to able-bodied civilians as possible. Veterans were shuttled off to rehabilitation facilities, where they took curative workshops that taught them how to perform basic tasks that they would need to know if they wanted to re-enter the civilian workforce. There were classes in woodworking, clerical work, car repair, and more. Despite the emphasis on making veterans look and act like they had not suffered in the trenches, the public had very little sympathy for them. Doctors did everything they could to force newly limbless soldiers to man up. Many nurses led their patients in stump-pounding drills, where they forced patients to walk on, pound, or thump what was left of ruined limbs. Physical therapists also tried stretching and massaging the limbs, but felt these methods would only be effective if they induced some degree of pain. The premier ideology of the time was that these veterans needed a firm hand, not coddling. They felt it was time for the soldiers to be cured of their disability, to fight their own bodies and their own minds until they were, quote, normal. Soldiers were told that if they wanted to overcome the ugliness they encountered on the Western Front, they needed to reject it. But a lot of this ugliness had become a part of the soldiers' lives, bodies, and minds, and the fact that they were encouraged to be silent made their situations worse.
A lot of societies have followed that kind of path. You know, it's over now. Don't think about this. Let's just pretend everything's back to normal. That kind of attitude tends not to work very well. I think society is getting better about talking about these things. It's much better than it was years ago. I mean, in World War I, there were no psychiatric medication. All of the medicines that are on the market today didn't exist. So now we have a definable problem, and we have defined treatments. Different world.